I bought my father a house after my mother died, put it in my name, kept him safe, gave him a place to grieve and rebuild his life. Everyone said I was a good son, but what I didn't know was that I'd just created the perfect trap, a trap that would catch the greediest vultures I'd ever meet. And they had no idea they were already caught. Before we continue, please comment below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to help us hit that big 1,000 subscriber milestone. It started 5 years ago, when my mother Eleanor lost her battle with cancer. She and my father Walter had been married for 43 years. They'd built a life together in that small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, raised me there, created memories in every corner. When she passed, my father fell apart. He stopped eating, stopped talking. He'd sit in their bedroom for hours just staring at her empty side of the bed. I lived 2 towns over with my wife Catherine, and every time I visited, he looked smaller, more hollow, like grief was eating him from the inside out. The house became a tomb. Everywhere he looked, he saw her, her garden, her reading chair, the kitchen where she'd made Sunday dinners for decades. He couldn't escape the memories, and the memories were killing him. That's when I made the decision. I'd sell the Maple Street house and buy him something new, a fresh start, somewhere without ghosts in every room. I had the money saved up. Catherine and I both worked good jobs, and we'd been careful with our finances. We could afford it. I found a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch house across town, bright, open, with a big backyard for Buddy, his golden retriever. The only living thing my father seemed to care about anymore. I put down the payment, signed all the papers. And here's the key detail. I kept the house in my name, not because I didn't trust my father, but because I was thinking ahead, estate planning, avoiding probate, making sure everything would be simple when the time came. My father was 73 years old, not getting any younger. This way, when he eventually passed, there'd be no legal mess, no fighting. The house would already be mine, clean and simple. I explained it to him. He understood. He even thanked me, said it made sense, said he trusted me completely. We shook hands on it, father and son, the same way we'd always done things. For the first year, things got better. My father started cooking again, started taking Buddy for walks. He even joined a seniors group at the community center. He was healing, slowly, but healing. Then he met Patricia. She was a widow too. Lost her husband 3 years before. She had a warm smile and a quick laugh, and she paid attention to my father in a way that made him stand up straighter. They started having coffee after the seniors' meetings, then dinner. Then she was at the house every weekend. I was happy for him. Truly. He deserved companionship, deserved to not be alone. Catherine and I invited them both over for dinner. Patricia seemed nice enough, asked questions about my work, complimented Catherine's cooking. She talked about her 2 daughters, Vanessa and Crystal, both grown and living their own lives. 6 months later, my father told me he was going to propose. I'll be honest, it felt fast, but he was 74 years old. He didn't have time to waste, and he looked happier than he'd been since my mother died. Who was I to stand in the way? They got married in a small ceremony at City Hall, just family. Patricia's daughters came. Vanessa was 42, worked in retail, recently divorced. Crystal was 38, between jobs, living with a roommate. They both hugged my father and called him Walt and said how happy they were that their mother found love again. Everything seemed fine, for about 3 months. Then Patricia suggested her daughters move in, just temporarily. Vanessa's divorce had left her broke. Crystal couldn't afford rent on her own. They just needed a few months to get back on their feet. The house had 3 bedrooms. There was space. My father was too kind to say no. But what I thought would be temporary became permanent real fast. Vanessa took over the master bedroom, said it had better light, pushed my father and Patricia into the smaller guest room. Crystal claimed the third bedroom and turned it into what she called her art studio, left paint supplies everywhere, played loud music at all hours. My father started sleeping on the couch, said it was easier for his back. But I knew the truth. He'd been pushed out of his own space. The worst part came with Buddy. Patricia complained that the dog shed too much, that he smelled, that he made her allergies act up. Never mind that she'd been around Buddy for months before getting married and never mentioned allergies once. Vanessa backed her up, said dog hair was getting on her clothes. Crystal said Buddy made her anxious. They ganged up on my father, 3 against 1, wore him down day after day, until finally he called me one night, voice shaking, asked if I could take Buddy, just for a little while, until things settled down. I drove over that same night, found my father sitting on the front porch with Buddy's leash in his hands. The dog was inside the house, and I could hear the women laughing in the living room, watching television, acting like they owned the place. My father handed me the leash. There were tears in his eyes. He whispered that he was sorry, that he didn't know what else to do, that they just wouldn't stop pushing. I took Buddy home with me, and I felt something shift in my chest, something cold and hard. This was wrong, all of it. These women had swooped into my father's life and taken over completely. They treated him like a guest, like an inconvenience. And he was too tired, too worn down to fight back. I started visiting more often, making excuses to stop by, and every time I did, the situation looked worse. The house was a mess, Vanessa's stuff everywhere, Crystal's art supplies taking over the dining room, Patricia holding court in the living room like a queen while my father did dishes in the kitchen. They'd redecorated. My mother's pictures were gone, replaced with Patricia's family photos. The furniture had been rearranged. Everything my father had built, everything he'd chosen, had been erased. One Sunday, I showed up unannounced, found my father in the backyard pulling weeds. He looked thin, too thin. I asked when he'd last had a real meal. He said he usually just made himself a sandwich, that the women didn't like him messing up the kitchen when they were cooking their dinners. Their dinners, not his. Theirs. I felt rage building in my throat, but I swallowed it down, stayed calm, because I was starting to realize something important. These women thought they'd won the lottery, thought they'd moved into a house they'd eventually inherit, thought my father was just a sweet old man they could manipulate. But they had no idea who actually owned the property. 2 years passed like this. 2 years of watching my father fade, of listening to him make excuses for why he couldn't come to holiday dinners, why he couldn't visit me and Catherine. Patricia always had some reason he needed to stay home, some task that couldn't wait, some event she'd planned that he had to attend. She was isolating him, keeping him under control. And her daughters were right there helping, taking his money for their bills, using his car, eating his food, contributing nothing. Then my father got sick, started having trouble breathing, went to the doctor, came back with news that made my blood run cold. Lung cancer, stage 4, too far gone for treatment, maybe 6 months, maybe less. I was with him when he told Patricia, expected tears, expected shock. Instead, I saw something else flash across her face. Just for a second. Something that looked almost like excitement, like relief. She caught herself quick, put on the sad wife face. But I'd seen it, and I'd never forget it. The next few months were hell. Hospice care, pain medication, My father shrinking in that hospital bed they set up in the living room. And through it all, those three women hovering like vultures. Patricia, playing the devoted wife. Vanessa and Crystal acting like grieving stepdaughters. But I heard them talking one night, stood outside the kitchen window while they thought my father was asleep. Heard Patricia telling her daughters not to worry, that everything would be fine, that the house was half hers as his wife, that they'd inherit it all, that they just had to wait a little longer. Crystal actually laughed, said she was already planning which room would be hers permanently. Vanessa said she'd finally be able to stop working retail, live off the house value. They were counting my father's money before he was even dead, planning their futures on his grave. And they had no clue. No clue at all that the house wasn't his to leave them, that every plan they were making was built on sand. My father died on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding his hand. Patricia was crying into a tissue. Dramatic, loud, making sure everyone saw her grief. The funeral was 3 days later. Patricia wore black and sobbed through the whole service. Vanessa and Crystal flanked her like bodyguards, accepting condolences, playing their parts perfectly. We buried my father next to my mother, together again. Finally, at peace. And as I stood at the grave watching them lower the casket, I felt that cold, hard thing in my chest grow colder. Harder, because I knew what was coming next, and they had absolutely no idea. The day after we buried my father, Patricia called a family meeting. She wanted to discuss the estate, said we needed to sort things out properly. Her voice had this edge to it now, not the soft, sweet tone she used when my father was alive. This was sharper, more demanding, like she was done playing nice. I told her I'd come by Saturday afternoon. Gave myself time to prepare, time to get all my documents in order, because what Patricia didn't know was that this wasn't going to be the meeting she thought it was. That week crawled by. Catherine asked me if I was ready, if I was sure about what I was going to do. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Those women had tortured my father for 3 years, made his final years miserable, turned his home into their personal kingdom while he slept on a couch and ate sandwiches alone. They deserved what was coming. Saturday arrived cold and grey, perfect weather for what I had planned. I drove to the house, my house, though they still didn't know that. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, looked at the place my father should have enjoyed in peace. The place that had been stolen from him by people who saw him as nothing but a meal ticket. I grabbed my folder of documents and headed to the door. Patricia answered. She'd already stopped wearing black, was dressed in jeans and a sweater, casual, comfortable, like she owned the place. She led me into the living room where Vanessa and Crystal were waiting. They'd rearranged the furniture again. My father had been gone less than a week, and they were already erasing him further. Patricia sat in the biggest chair, the one my father used to sit in. Vanessa and Crystal took the couch. They left me the small wooden chair in the corner, the uncomfortable one. Even the seating arrangement was a power play. Patricia folded her hands in her lap and smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who thinks they're holding all the cards. "Daniel," she said, "I'm glad you could come. We need to discuss the house and your father's assets. As his widow, I inherit 50% of everything automatically. The other 50% should be divided between you and me according to his will. But Walter didn't leave a formal will, so we'll need to work this out fairly." I almost laughed. The confidence in her voice, the absolute certainty. She really believed she was about to become a homeowner, that she'd won. Vanessa jumped in. "Mum's been so stressed about all this. We think the best solution is for her to keep the house. You have your own place. You don't need this one. We can buy out your share over time, monthly payments, whatever works for you." Buy out my share. With what money? None of these women had jobs. But that wasn't even the best part. Crystal nodded along. It would mean so much to Mom to stay here. This is her home now, where she built her life with Walt. We can't just uproot her. Built her life. 3 years. She'd been here 3 years. My father had lived here for 5. And before that, he'd lived with my mother for 43 years in the house I'd sold to buy this one. But sure, Patricia had built her life here. I let them talk, let them lay out their whole plan. How Patricia would keep the master bedroom, how Vanessa and Crystal would stay to help their mother, how they'd rent out the 3rd bedroom for extra income. They had it all figured out. When they finally stopped talking, I opened my folder, pulled out the first document, the deed to the house, and I slid it across the coffee table to Patricia. "This is the property deed," I said, my voice calm, even. "Take a look at the name on it." Patricia picked it up. Her eyes scanned the page. I watched her face as the words registered, as her brain tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The confusion, then the disbelief, then something close to panic. "This must be a mistake," she said. "This says your name, not Walter's." "That's not a mistake," I said. "I bought this house 5 years ago, after my mother died. I paid for it. I signed for it. It's been in my name the entire time. My father lived here, but he never owned it." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Vanessa grabbed the deed from her mother's hands, read it herself. Her face went pale. "But that's impossible," Vanessa said. "Walt lived here. This was his house. He lived here because I let him," I said. "I bought it for him so he'd have a place to grieve and heal after my mother died. I kept it in my name for estate planning purposes, to avoid probate, to keep things simple." Patricia's face had gone from pale to red, anger replacing shock. "You tricked him. You manipulated an old man." "I didn't trick anyone," I said. "My father knew exactly whose name was on the deed. We discussed it. He agreed it made sense. He thanked me for it." Crystal stood up, started pacing. "This can't be legal. You can't just kick us out. Mom is his widow. She has rights." "She has rights to his personal belongings," I said. "His car, his bank account, his clothes. But she has 0 rights to property she never owned. Property her husband never owned." I pulled out another document. The original purchase agreement, showed them my signature, my name on every single page. Then I pulled out 5 years of property tax receipts, all paid by me. Insurance documents, all in my name. "I have every piece of paperwork," I said. 5 years of documentation proving continuous ownership. There's no legal gray area here. This house is mine. It always has been." But that wasn't even the part that was going to hurt them most. Patricia was shaking now, rage and fear mixing together. "So what are you saying? You're throwing us out? Your father just died and you're evicting his widow?" "I'm saying you have a choice," I said. "You can stay here and pay rent, fair market rate, $1,500 a month, or you can leave." $1,500. These women who hadn't worked in years, who'd been living rent-free on my father's kindness. Their faces told me everything I needed to know about whether they could afford that. Vanessa exploded. "Rent? You want us to pay you rent to live in the house your father lived in? That's disgusting. That's cruel." "What's cruel," I said, my voice getting harder now, "is how you treated my father. What's cruel is making a 78-year-old man sleep on a couch in his own home. What's cruel is forcing him to give up his dog. What's cruel is isolating him from his family and treating him like a servant while you 3 lived like queens." "We took care of him," Patricia said, her voice shrill now, defensive. "You took everything from him," I shot back. "His comfort, his dignity, his peace." I watched him shrink, watched him fade. And you know what? I heard you that night, 3 weeks before he died, outside the kitchen window, planning how you'd split up his estate, laughing about finally having money, counting his inheritance before he was even cold. Crystal's face went white. Vanessa looked at the floor. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. They knew exactly what night I was talking about. They knew they'd been caught. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. You have 30 days to decide. Pay rent and stay. Or pack your things and leave. Those are your only options. Patricia found her voice again, but it came out as a shriek. I'm not paying you a single cent. This house belongs to me. I'm Walter's wife. I have a right to live here. You have the right to live anywhere you can afford, I said. This isn't that place, not unless you pay. I stood up, collected my documents. Put them back in the folder. The meeting was over as far as I was concerned. But Vanessa blocked my path to the door. You can't do this. We'll fight to from you. We'll get a lawyer. Go ahead, I said. Waste your money on a lawyer who'll tell you exactly what I just told you. You have no claim to this property. None. Get a dozen lawyers if you want. They'll all say the same thing. I moved past her, headed for the door. But Patricia's voice stopped me. Cold. Venomous. Nothing like the sweet widow act she'd performed at the funeral. You'll regret this, Daniel. We're not leaving, and we're not paying you a dime. You want us out? You'll have to drag us out. And we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of son you are, evicting your father's widow while she's still grieving. The whole town will know. I turned back to look at her. This woman who'd married my father for a place to live, who'd brought her daughters in like parasites, who'd made his last years hell. Let them know, I said. Let the whole town know, because when they hear the full story, when they hear how you treated him, they'll understand exactly why I'm doing this. I walked out, got in my car, and drove away. Behind me I could hear shouting, cursing, the sound of something breaking. They were falling apart already. Good. Catherine was waiting when I got home, asked how it went. I told her everything. She hugged me tight and said I did the right thing, that my father would be proud. But I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Patricia had made a threat, said they wouldn't leave, said they wouldn't pay, which meant I'd have to force them out legally, which meant lawyers and courts and time. I was ready for that fight, had been ready since the day they took Buddy away. What I wasn't ready for was the letter that arrived 3 days later. Certified mail, from a law office I'd never heard of. I opened it, standing in my driveway, read the first line, and felt ice water flood my veins. Patricia wasn't just refusing to leave. She was suing me, claiming my father had been mentally incompetent when we discussed the house, claiming I'd exploited him, claiming she had a right to the property through common law marriage principles and equity arguments. She was trying to take my house, the house I'd bought with my own money, the house I'd given my father out of love. She was actually trying to steal it, and according to the lawsuit, she had a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. I sat in my lawyer's office, staring at Patricia's lawsuit. 23 pages of lies, claims that my father had been suffering from dementia, that I'd manipulated him into signing away his rights, that he'd believed the house was his until the day he died, that I'd committed elder abuse. My lawyer, Thomas Reed, was 60 years old and had been practicing family law for 35 years. He read through the entire document twice before he spoke. "This is aggressive," he said. "She's throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. The dementia claim is the dangerous part. If she can prove your father wasn't mentally competent when you bought the house, she might have a case for undue influence." My stomach dropped. My father was sharp until the very end. He knew exactly what was happening. "Can you prove that?" Thomas asked. And that's when I realized the problem. I had documents proving I owned the house, but I didn't have anything proving my father had been competent and willing. No written agreement between us. No letter from him confirming the arrangement. Just a handshake and trust between father and son. Patricia's lawyers were smart. They'd found the one crack in my armor. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare. Patricia went on a campaign to destroy my reputation. She posted on social media about how I'd stolen her dying husband's house, how I was a greedy son who'd exploited his father, how she was a poor widow being thrown out on the street. People I'd known for years started looking at me differently. Some believed her. Others weren't sure what to believe. My phone blew up with messages, some supportive, some accusatory. I stopped answering. Catherine told me to stay strong. That the truth would come out, but I could see the stress wearing on her too. This wasn't what either of us had signed up for. Thomas filed a counter-motion, presented all my documentation, the deed, the tax receipts, 5 years of proof. But Patricia's lawyer fired back with medical records, showed that my father had been on pain medication, had been treated for depression after my mother died, argued that his mental state had been compromised. It was all twisted, all manipulated. But it looked bad on paper. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. I barely slept the night before, kept going over everything in my head. What if the judge believed her? What if I lost the house because I'd trusted my father's word instead of getting everything in writing? We arrived at the courthouse early. Thomas carried 2 briefcases full of documents. I carried the weight of 5 years of watching my father suffer, of knowing what these women had done to him, of needing the truth to matter more than legal technicalities. Patricia showed up dressed like she was going to another funeral. Black dress, tissues in hand, her daughters on either side of her. They'd brought their own audience too. Friends, people from her church, all there to support the grieving widow. I had Catherine. That was it. But that was enough. We went into the courtroom. Judge Morrison presiding. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Thomas said that was good, said she'd see through the theatrics. But as Patricia's lawyer presented their case, I started to worry. He was good, really good. He painted a picture of a vulnerable old man who'd just lost his wife, who'd been taken advantage of by his own son, who'd lived in a house believing it was his, only to have it stolen away after his death. He showed photos of my father in his final weeks. Thin, weak, barely conscious. Made it look like I'd waited until he was helpless to make my move. It was a lie, all of it. But it was a convincing lie. Then it was Thomas's turn. He presented the timeline. Showed that I'd bought the house 5 years before my father died, when he was still healthy, still active. He presented documentation of my father's medical records from that time. No dementia, no cognitive decline, just grief. He showed the property records, the continuous ownership, the fact that I'd paid every bill for 5 years, that my father had never paid rent, never contributed to the mortgage because this had been a gift, a place for him to live out of love, not obligation. But Patricia's lawyer kept hammering the same point. Where was the written agreement? Where was proof that my father understood and consented to this arrangement? And that's when something happened that I didn't expect. The courtroom door opened. A man I didn't recognize walked in. Mid-50s, grey suit. He approached Thomas and whispered something. Thomas's eyes went wide. He asked the judge for a brief recess. She granted it. In the hallway, the man introduced himself. Leonard Watts, my father's estate attorney. And he was holding an envelope. Your father came to see me 6 months before he died, Leonard said. He wanted to make sure certain things were documented. He was very specific about his wishes. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a letter, written in my father's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death. It explained everything: how I'd bought him the house, how he'd agreed to the arrangement, how grateful he was for my generosity, how he knew the house was mine and wanted it to stay that way. But that wasn't the devastating part. The second document was another letter, this one written 3 months before he died, after Patricia and her daughters had moved in. It detailed everything they had done, how they'd taken over his home, how they'd forced him to give up Buddy, how Patricia had started asking about his assets and talking about inheritance, how he'd heard Vanessa and Crystal planning their future in their house. He'd known. He'd known exactly what they were doing, and he'd documented it. The third document was the one that made my throat close up. It was a formal statement, notarized and witnessed, declaring that he was of sound mind, that he understood his son owned the house, that he wanted it that way, that any claims made by his wife, Patricia, after his death should be dismissed as fraudulent. He'd protected me from beyond the grave. We went back into the courtroom. Thomas presented all 3 documents, read them aloud. Patricia's face went from confident to confused to horrified as she realized what was happening. My father's words, in his own hand, destroyed her entire case. But Thomas wasn't done. He pulled out one more thing, something Leonard had been holding back: a thumb drive. My father had been recording conversations in the house. Not all of them, just some, including the one I'd overheard through the kitchen window, the one where Patricia and her daughters had laughed about inheriting everything, had talked about my father like he was already dead, had celebrated their upcoming windfall. Thomas played 30 seconds of it. That's all he needed? Patricia's lawyer tried to object, tried to claim the recordings were inadmissible, but Judge Morrison shut him down, said she wanted to hear them, wanted to understand what kind of household this had been. We played 3 recordings total, each one worse than the last. Patricia complaining about my father to her daughters, calling him pathetic, saying she couldn't wait until he died so they could finally live freely. Vanessa saying she'd earned this house by putting up with the old man. Crystal laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate him. The courtroom was silent. Even Patricia's supporters looked sick. Judge Morrison didn't even need to deliberate. She ruled from the bench, dismissed Patricia's lawsuit with prejudice, confirmed my ownership of the property, ordered Patricia, Vanessa, and Crystal to vacate within 7 days. And then she did something I didn't expect. She ordered them to pay my legal fees, said the lawsuit had been frivolous and malicious, said she was appalled by what she'd heard in those recordings, said that attempting to defraud someone out of their property by exploiting a death was one of the most cynical things she'd seen in her courtroom. Patricia sobbed. Real tears this time, but not tears of grief, tears of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. They were gone within 5 days, left the house trashed, holes in the walls, broken fixtures, one last act of spite. But I didn't care. I had contractors in there within a week, fixed everything, repainted, made it clean again. I sold the house 2 months later. Couldn't keep it. Couldn't live there. Too many memories of my father's suffering. Too much pain soaked into the walls. But I got a good price. Used some of the money to set up a scholarship fund in my mother's name. Donated the rest to a hospice charity. The house is gone now. Patricia and her daughters scattered. Last I heard, Vanessa moved back in with a friend. Crystal went to live with Patricia in a tiny apartment across town. They're not my problem anymore. But here's what haunts me, what keeps me up some nights. My father spent his final years being tortured by people who saw him as nothing but a paycheck. And he knew it. He documented it. He recorded it. He protected me legally. But he never told me how bad it really was. Never asked me to intervene. never said he wanted them gone. Why? Pride, fear. The desperate hope that if he just endured a little longer, they might actually love him. I'll never know. And that's what I lost in all of this. The chance to save him while he was still alive. I got justice. I kept my house. I exposed the truth. But I lost the chance to give my father peace in his final years. Some victories cost more than you expect. This one cost me the belief that I'd been a good enough son, that I'd paid close enough attention, that I'd protected him the way he'd always protected me. But I learned something from my father's choice to document everything, from his careful preparation, from the way he made sure the truth would survive him, even if he couldn't speak it himself while alive. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is make sure your story gets told, even after you're gone. Thanks for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories like this. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.